The garage was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Michael stood in the dim light, his shadow stretching long and distorted against the concrete walls. His hand trembled as he replayed the voicemail for the third time, each word driving a stake deeper into his chest. "It's done," the voice said, calm and chilling. "We'll get rid of him soon. After that, we can move forward." Michael's pulse thundered in his ears, drowning out the hum of the refrigerator. His knees threatened to give way, but he leaned against the workbench, his fingers gripping its edge so tightly his knuckles turned white. The voice was unmistakable. It was his voice. Gerald Turner, the CEO of Turner Enterprises, the man Michael's wife, Laura, had been working closely with for the past 2 years. The man Michael had welcomed into their home for family dinners. The man who was now plotting his murder. The voicemail ended with a faint beep, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. Michael's throat felt dry, his mouth unable to form words. He looked down at the phone in his hand, its screen reflecting his own pale, sweat-slicked face. His mind raced, each thought a fragment of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to complete. Earlier that evening, Laura had breezed into the house with her usual air of practiced indifference. She had kissed Michael on the cheek, perfunctory, distant, and gone straight upstairs under the pretense of catching up on emails. Her perfume lingered, a cloying sweetness that felt like an insult now. It wasn't the scent of the woman he'd married. It was new, expensive, and foreign, like her. Michael had followed her movement with quiet eyes, the weight of her coldness pressing down on him. He wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but fear rooted him to the spot. The fear of what he might uncover, of what he already suspected but couldn't yet bring himself to believe. Now, standing alone in the garage, Michael pieced together the fragments. The late-night meetings, the unexplained absences, the secretive phone calls. And this voicemail, a confirmation of the unthinkable. He wasn't just losing his wife to another man. He was being erased, discarded like an inconvenience. The cold, metallic scent of the garage mixed with the faint odor of motor oil. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps, and his vision blurred with unshed tears. He clutched the phone tighter, his thoughts shifting from despair to something darker, something resolute. He had spent years sacrificing for his family, raising children he now feared weren't his own, all while his wife schemed behind his back. And now they wanted to take his life, not without a fight. Michael wiped his face with the back of his hand, smearing the tears. His jaw tightened, his lips pressing into a thin, determined line. He slid the phone into his pocket and straightened his back, his heart still racing but his resolve growing stronger. "If they think I'm going to roll over and die," he muttered under his breath, "they've got another thing coming." The garage door groaned as Michael pushed it open, stepping out into the cool night air. The stars above seemed indifferent to his pain, but the chill steadied him, sharpening his focus. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war, and Michael was ready to fight back. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen windows, casting a warm glow on the tidy, suburban home Michael had built with his own hands. The smell of coffee brewing mingled with the faint scent of pancakes sizzling on the griddle. For a moment, the scene was perfect, a snapshot of the life Michael had spent years nurturing. At the kitchen table, his daughter Emma, 8, giggled as she scrolled through her tablet. Across from her, 13-year-old Lucas was hunched over his math homework, mumbling complaints about fractions. Michael flipped a pancake with practiced ease, glancing at the clock. "Mom's running late again," Lucas muttered, his voice barely audible over Emma's laughter. Michael forced a smile, though his heart ached at the comment. "She's busy with work, buddy. Let's cut her some slack. All right?" Laura breezed into the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tiled floor. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored gray suit, her hair perfectly styled, makeup flawless. She paused at the doorway, glancing briefly at Michael before leaning down to kiss Emma on the forehead. "Morning, sweetheart," she said, her tone light and cheerful. To Lucas, she added, "Don't forget your soccer practice after school." She turned to Michael, who stood by the stove, spatula in hand. Her gaze barely met his before flitting away. "I'll grab breakfast on the way," she said curtly, already heading for the door. "Laura," Michael called, his voice soft but steady. "You don't have time to sit for 5 minutes?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob, and for a fleeting moment, something flickered in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or irritation. "I have a meeting," she said simply, before disappearing out the door. As the front door closed, the warmth of the morning seemed to dissipate. Michael turned back to the stove, flipping the pancakes mechanically. Emma looked up from her tablet, her wide eyes filled with innocence. "Why is Mom always so busy?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. Michael swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "Because she works really hard to give us a good life," he said, though the words felt hollow. Lucas didn't look up from his homework. "She wasn't busy like this before," he muttered under his breath. Later, at work, Michael found himself staring blankly at his computer screen. The hum of the office around him felt distant, as if he were underwater. A coworker, Sarah, stopped by his desk, her brow furrowed. "You all right, Mike? You've been zoning out all morning." Michael shook his head as if to clear it. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well last night." Sarah hesitated, then offered a small smile. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. You've got a lot on your plate with the kids and all." Her words lingered long after she walked away. He had sacrificed so much for his family. Turned down promotions to ensure he was always home for Emma and Lucas. Skipped weekend trips with friends to be the father he had never had growing up. And yet, Laura's absence loomed larger with each passing day, a chasm that threatened to swallow their once perfect life. That evening, Michael stood in the doorway of Emma's room, watching as she carefully arranged her dolls in a row. He couldn't help but smile at her concentration, but his chest tightened with the weight of the truth he was now carrying. How much longer could he protect her and Lucas from the reality of what was happening? In the master bedroom, Laura's suitcase sat half-packed on the bed. She had mentioned a business retreat earlier in the week, but now, the sight of it filled Michael with a deep, gnawing dread. He stepped inside and ran his fingers over the smooth leather of the case, his mind replaying the voicemail from the night before. The weight of everything threatened to crush him. The betrayal, the lies, the danger he now knew lurked in the shadows. But as he stood there, staring at the suitcase, a single thought pierced through the chaos. They thought he was weak. They thought they had him fooled. Michael turned and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. His jaw tightened as resolve took hold. He wasn't weak, and he wasn't going to let them destroy what little was left of the life he had built. The days following the voicemail played out like a cruel masquerade. Laura carried on as though nothing was amiss, her polished veneer intact, while Michael found himself studying every word, every gesture, for hidden meaning. The cracks in her facade were subtle, but once seen, they were impossible to ignore. That evening, Michael sat at the dining table with Emma and Lucas, trying to focus on their chatter about school. Laura had claimed she was staying late at the office to finalize a project. The excuse was familiar, too familiar. He barely heard Lucas's story about a soccer goal he'd scored, his mind looping over the inconsistencies in Laura's behavior. The shrill ring of his phone broke his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. Unknown number. Hesitating, he picked up. "Michael Hayes?" a woman's voice asked. "Yes, who's this?" "This is Kathy, the assistant at Turner Enterprises. I thought you should know. I saw Laura having dinner with Mr. Turner last night. It seemed personal." The line went dead before Michael could respond. The following morning, Michael awoke to the sound of Laura's phone buzzing on the nightstand. She was in the shower, her melodic hum floating through the door. He reached for the phone, heart pounding. The screen lit up with a message preview. "Gerald Turner. Last night was unforgettable. Let's meet again tonight. Same place." Michael's chest constricted, a nauseating wave of anger and betrayal crashing over him. His fingers itched to unlock the phone, but he knew the code had been changed recently. Another subtle sign he had ignored until now. He put it back, his mind reeling. That evening, Laura returned home earlier than expected, her face flushed. She carried a shopping bag from a luxury boutique, her usual calm demeanor slightly off-kilter. "Treating yourself?" Michael asked, his voice deliberately neutral. "Oh, just something small for a client meeting," she replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. She left the bag on the counter and disappeared upstairs. Curiosity gnawed at him. He opened the bag carefully, pulling out a sleek black box. Inside was a pair of diamond earrings, dazzling under the kitchen lights. They were elegant, extravagant, far beyond anything she'd worn before. Michael closed the box, his hands trembling. He had no illusions that those earrings were meant for her client meeting. The next day, while Laura was out, Michael searched her office at home. Amid neatly stacked files and stationery, a crumpled receipt caught his eye. It was for an upscale restaurant, the same one Kathy had mentioned. The date matched one of Laura's late nights. As he held the receipt, rage boiled beneath his skin. He thought of the sacrifices he had made. Turning down job offers, giving up weekends, and working overtime to ensure their family's stability. All while Laura dined with Gerald Turner, laughing over glasses of wine. Later that week, Michael confided in his friend Jake over coffee. Jake had been Michael's sounding board for years, always offering level-headed advice. "I feel like I'm losing my mind," Michael admitted. "She's distant, secretive. And now, I've got proof she's seeing him." Jake frowned, his brow furrowed. "You deserve the truth, man. But be careful. If she's hiding this, who knows what else she's capable of?" Michael nodded, Jake's words cutting deeper than he expected. He couldn't shake the thought of the voicemail, the chilling certainty in Gerald Turner's voice. "We'll get rid of him soon." That night, as Michael lay in bed, pretending to be asleep, he felt Laura slip quietly out of the room. The faint creak of the stairs followed. His pulse quickened. Silently, he rose and followed, keeping a safe distance. He saw her standing by the living room window, the glow of her phone illuminating her face. She was smiling, a soft, intimate smile he hadn't seen in years. "Tomorrow night will be perfect," she whispered into the phone. "He has no idea." Michael froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The betrayal was no longer just a suspicion. It was a cold, unrelenting truth. The cracks in the facade were widening, and Michael knew it was only a matter of time before the entire illusion shattered. But he wouldn't let it break him. Not yet. The storm broke the following evening, both outside and within Michael's life. Rain lashed against the windows as he sat in the darkened living room, his mind churning with the fragments of evidence he had gathered. Every receipt, every message, every whispered phone call had pointed to the truth. But now, it was time to confront it head-on. Laura had left for her business retreat just after dinner. She kissed Emma and Lucas goodnight with a tenderness that made Michael's stomach twist in knots. For him, there was only a hurried, distracted goodbye as she grabbed her suitcase and stepped into the waiting car. Michael followed, the taillights of her cab disappearing into the rain-soaked streets. In his own car, he trailed at a safe distance, the shadows of the city swallowing him whole. His destination, a luxury downtown hotel, confirmed his worst fears. From the parking lot, he watched as Laura stepped out of the cab, her coat clutched tightly around her. Moments later, Gerald Turner appeared from the lobby, an umbrella shielding him from the rain, as he guided her inside with an intimacy that sent a fresh wave of nausea crashing over Michael. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. This wasn't just an affair. This was something darker, something insidious. Michael pulled his phone from the dashboard and dialed the number of the private investigator he'd hired weeks earlier. "They're here," he whispered. "Send the drone." From his vantage point, Michael watched the drone hover silently above the hotel's glass exterior. Through the camera feed on his phone, he saw them, Laura and Gerald, entering a suite on the top floor. Gerald poured champagne as Laura removed her coat, revealing the dress she had bought for a client meeting. They toasted, their laughter echoing even in the silent footage. Michael felt the ground beneath him shift. This wasn't just infidelity. It was a complete betrayal of everything he had built, everything he had sacrificed. The next morning, The private investigator delivered the final blow. A folder thick with photos and documents. There were pictures of Laura and Gerald dining together, shopping together, and, most damningly, playing with Emma and Lucas in the park while Michael was at work. One image stopped his breath entirely. Gerald lifting Emma onto his shoulders, Laura beaming at them like a picture-perfect family. Michael stared at the photo, his hands trembling. How long had this been going on? How much of his life had been a lie? That evening, he sat in the quiet of Emma's room as she read aloud from her favorite book. Her voice was soft, innocent, and oblivious to the storm tearing through their family. Michael's chest ached with the weight of what he had seen, of what he now knew. As she drifted to sleep, Michael kissed her forehead and whispered, "I'll protect you, I promise." Back in the master bedroom, Michael confronted the evidence spread out before him. The photos, the texts, the receipts. All of it painted a picture he could no longer ignore. His gaze fell on a framed photo of their wedding day on the dresser. Laura's smile in the photo seemed mocking now, a cruel reminder of the promises she had so easily broken. In a moment of raw emotion, Michael hurled the frame across the room. It shattered against the wall, shards of glass scattering like the pieces of his heart. He sank to the floor, the weight of betrayal crushing him. Memories of their early years flooded his mind. Her laughter as they painted their first apartment. The tears they shared when Emma was born. The nights they stayed up dreaming of a future together. That future was gone. The final nail in the coffin came the following night when Michael overheard Laura on another call. Standing outside the bathroom door, he heard her voice, low and conspiratorial. "His life insurance is substantial," she said. "It'll be enough to start over. We just need to stick to the plan." Michael's blood ran cold. He backed away silently, his mind racing. This wasn't just betrayal. This was a plot against his life. As he sat in the garage later that night, replaying her words over and over, a new emotion began to take root. It wasn't despair. It wasn't even anger. It was resolve. The house was eerily silent that evening, the kind of silence that hummed with the weight of unspoken words. Michael sat in the living room, the folder of evidence resting heavily on his lap. His heart pounded like a war drum, each beat bringing him closer to the inevitable confrontation. Upstairs, he could hear Laura humming softly as she prepared for another late meeting. The sound was almost surreal, so casual, so unaffected, given the storm brewing beneath their roof. When she finally descended the stairs, her heels clicking against the hardwood, Michael stood. His presence filled the room, and the tension crackled like static electricity. "Laura," he said, his voice steady but laced with steel. "We need to talk." She froze for a moment, then forced a smile. "Can it wait? I'm running late." "No," Michael replied, stepping forward. He held up the folder, his hand trembling with restrained fury. "It can't wait." Her eyes flicked to the folder, and for the first time in months, Michael saw a flicker of unease break through her polished facade. "What's that?" "Proof," he said simply, his voice sharp as a blade. "Proof of every lie, every betrayal. Proof of you and Gerald." Laura's face paled, but she recovered quickly, her tone shifting to defensive. "Michael, I don't know what you think you've found, but this is ridiculous." Michael's laugh was bitter, hollow. He opened the folder and threw the photos onto the coffee table. Images of her and Gerald filled the surface, dining together, walking hand in hand, and the one that cut the deepest, their children laughing with Gerald at the park. "Ridiculous," Michael spat, his voice rising. "You've been having an affair for years. I've sacrificed everything for this family, and you've been destroying it behind my back." Laura's eyes darted to the photos, her mask of calm slipping. "You've been spying on me?" Michael's anger flared. "Spying on you? Don't turn this on me, Laura. This isn't about what I've done. It's about what you've done. About what you and he have been planning." She faltered, then sat down, her shoulders stiff. "I'm not going to apologize for wanting more, Michael. Do you even realize how predictable you've become? How boring our life is?" Michael stared at her, his heart splintering further with every word. Boring? You think this is about being bored? You had everything I could give, and it wasn't enough. Tears welled in her eyes, but Michael couldn't tell if they were genuine or another act. I never wanted to hurt you, she said softly. His laugh was sharp and cold. Never wanted to hurt me? Laura, you're plotting to kill me. Don't even try to deny it. I've heard the calls. I know about the life insurance. I know everything. Laura's mask shattered completely. Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like a cornered animal. Michael, it's not what you think. Then tell me, he interrupted, his voice cutting through hers. Tell me what it is, Laura. Tell me why my life means so little to you. Why the man I let into our home is now planning to take everything from me. With your help. Her silence was deafening. Was any of it real? He asked, his voice breaking. Our marriage, our family? Were the kids even mine? That question seemed to stab deeper than the others. Laura's eyes widened, and for the first time, she looked truly shaken. Michael, of course the kids are yours. Don't you dare question that. But everything else, Michael said bitterly, was a lie. Laura stood abruptly, her composure snapping. You don't understand, Michael. You never understood. Gerald offered me something you couldn't, a way out. A life that wasn't suffocating. I didn't know how to stop it. Michael took a step closer, his presence towering over her. You're right about one thing, Laura. I don't understand. I don't understand how the woman I married could become this stranger who looks at me like I'm nothing more than an obstacle in her way. She flinched but met his gaze, her voice trembling with frustration and fear. You're in the way of our future, Michael. Gerald and I, we had a plan. But you... She stopped herself, realizing she had said too much. Michael's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Well, Laura, he said, his voice deadly calm. You're not going to get your future. Not with him, not at my expense. He turned and walked toward the door, pausing only to say, Pack your things. You're not coming back to this house. Not ever. As the door slammed shut behind him, Michael felt the weight of the confrontation settle over him. His heartbreak was raw, his anger scorching, but beneath it all was a new resolve. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Michael sat in his office late that night, the house eerily quiet without Laura's presence. A single desk lamp illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the scattered evidence on his desk. Photos, receipts, messages, and the damning voicemail. He knew what he had to do. The grief and anger that had consumed him over the past weeks were now fuel for something sharper, more focused. This wasn't just about survival, it was about justice. And justice, Michael decided, required patience and precision. The next morning, Michael reached for his phone and dialed Laura's number. His voice, calm and steady, carried a tone she hadn't heard in weeks. Laura, he said, I've been thinking. We both made mistakes. Maybe we should talk and figure this out. There was a pause on the other end before Laura answered, her voice wary but curious. Michael, I didn't expect this from you. Well, Michael said, forcing a chuckle, I realize that for the kids' sake, we need to at least try to move forward. Her hesitation lasted a moment longer, but then she agreed to meet him for dinner. Michael's heart clenched at the thought of sitting across from her, pretending to bridge the gap between them. But he knew this was the first move in his game. While Laura believed Michael was working late or out with friends, he spent his evenings methodically dismantling the empire Gerald Turner had built. He began by reaching out to Kathy, the assistant who had tipped him off. She was hesitant at first, but Michael's sincerity won her over. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, she revealed details of Gerald's shady dealings. Embezzlement, offshore accounts, and bribery. You're not just taking him down for personal reasons, are you? Kathy asked, her eyes searching his. Michael shook his head. This is about justice. He's hurt too many people, and it's time he answers for it. She handed him a USB drive. This has everything you need. Just be careful. Gerald doesn't play fair. Through Kathy's connections, Michael was introduced to Sam, a former employee of Turner Enterprises who had been fired after threatening to expose the CEO's corruption. Sam's bitterness toward Gerald was palpable, and he eagerly provided insider knowledge about the company's illegal operations. Over beers at a dimly lit bar, Sam leaned in and said, "Gerald thinks he's untouchable. If you're going after him, make sure you hit where it hurts the most, his reputation." Michael nodded, jotting down notes as Sam outlined the key players and weak points in Gerald's network. Michael began to assemble his plan, using the evidence and intel he had gathered. His strategy was meticulous. 1. Leaking evidence. He anonymously sent documents to financial regulators, exposing Gerald's offshore accounts and embezzlement. 2. Building an alibi. He ensured his actions couldn't be traced back to him, carefully covering his tracks. 3. Exploiting weaknesses. He planted rumors within Turner Enterprises about Gerald's crumbling empire, sowing discord among the employees. Each step required precision and caution. There were moments of tension when he felt the walls closing in, like the time Gerald's security team spotted him near the office building late at night. But Michael always managed to stay one step ahead. One evening, Laura called him, her tone overly sweet. "Dinner was nice the other night, Michael. I think we're making progress." Michael clenched his jaw, keeping his voice steady. "I think so too. Maybe we should do it again soon." He could almost hear the smile in her voice. "I'd like that." Hanging up, Michael allowed himself a grim smile. She had no idea he was setting her and Gerald up for the fall of their lives. The tension reached a breaking point when Gerald himself called Michael, feigning concern. "Michael," Gerald began smoothly, "I've heard about your reconciliation with Laura. I just want you to know, no hard feelings." Michael's hand tightened around the phone, but his tone remained neutral. "Thanks, Gerald. I appreciate that. I hope we can all move on," Gerald continued, "for everyone's sake." The call ended, but Michael knew Gerald wasn't fooled. The game had become a battle of wits, and Michael had to ensure he stayed one step ahead. The quiet hum of Michael's office was deceptive, masking the chaos he was about to unleash. The weight of betrayal still sat heavy in his chest, but he no longer felt like a victim. Each piece of evidence he had collected, every name he had written down, was another weapon in his arsenal. Tonight, the first move in his meticulously planned revenge would unfold. Michael sat at his desk, the USB drive Kathy had given him plugged into his laptop. The screen glowed with incriminating files. Spreadsheets detailing offshore accounts, correspondence confirming bribes, and contracts forged to secure illegal deals. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing a concise email to the financial authorities. Subject: Urgent. Evidence of corporate fraud. Turner Enterprises. The email detailed Gerald's involvement in embezzlement and tax evasion, attaching key files as proof. To ensure anonymity, Michael routed his message through a secure VPN and a disposable email account. After hitting send, he leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. It wasn't just the authorities he was targeting. The media needed to see this. Michael composed another email with the same evidence and sent it to a journalist notorious for exposing corporate scandals. By morning, the first cracks in Gerald's empire would begin to show. Michael had learned through Sam that Gerald was on the verge of closing a multimillion-dollar merger with a rival company. It was a deal Gerald had been carefully orchestrating for months, a keystone in maintaining his image of success. Using information from Kathy, Michael posed as a whistleblower and contacted the rival company's legal team, warning them about Gerald's unethical practices. He attached documents highlighting Gerald's financial misdeeds and ongoing investigations. "Make your decisions carefully," the email concluded. "This merger could tarnish your company's reputation permanently." The next day, Michael received a text from Sam. "Sam, heard Turner's deal is on thin ice. You didn't, by any chance, have something to do with it?" Michael smirked, replying, "Michael, just leveling the playing field." At home, Laura's demeanor began to shift. Her usually cool and composed facade now showed cracks. She spent hours on her phone, her voice hushed but urgent as she paced the living room. One evening, As Michael poured himself a glass of whiskey, he overheard her conversation. "We can't afford this right now, Gerald," she hissed. "If this gets out, everything we've worked for will fall apart." Michael let the words sink in, savoring the rising panic in her voice. He clinked the ice in his glass, loud enough to startle her. She turned abruptly, her face pale. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, feigning concern. Laura forced a smile. "Just work stress. Must be tough," Michael said, his tone dripping with mock sympathy. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." She nodded stiffly, retreating upstairs. Michael watched her go, satisfaction curling in his chest. Michael knew he was playing a dangerous game. One misstep and everything could unravel. Late one night, while accessing Turner Enterprises' internal network through the backdoor credentials Kathy had provided, an alert flashed on his screen. "Unauthorized access detected. Tracing IP." Michael's heart pounded as he quickly severed the connection, shutting down his computer. He sat in the dark, listening for the telltale sounds of approaching cars or voices outside. But the night remained silent. The next morning, he received a text from Kathy. "Kathy, Gerald's IT team is on high alert. Be careful." Michael replied, "Michael, always am." The following week, headlines broke across major news outlets. Turner Enterprises under investigation for fraud and corruption. The article detailed the evidence Michael had leaked, highlighting Gerald's offshore accounts and illegal deals. The fallout was immediate. Investors began pulling out, employees started resigning, and Gerald's reputation took a devastating blow. At home, Laura's panic escalated. She snapped at the children, barely 8, and spent most of her time locked in the bedroom on calls with Gerald. Michael, meanwhile, played the part of the supportive husband, his mask of concern hiding his growing confidence. One evening, Laura confronted him. "Michael," she said, her voice strained, "you've been different lately. Is something going on?" Michael met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Just trying to keep things normal for the kids," he said. "Unlike some people." Her eyes narrowed, but she said nothing, retreating back to her phone. The morning air was crisp as Michael stood at his kitchen window, sipping coffee. The newspaper lay open on the counter, the headline blaring, "Turner Enterprises faces federal raid amid corruption scandal." A grim smile tugged at his lips. The trap he had set had finally sprung. Across town, chaos erupted at Turner Enterprises. Federal agents swarmed the sleek glass building, armed with warrants and determination. Gerald Turner's carefully cultivated empire was laid bare as investigators seized documents, servers, and financial records. Employees gawked from their desks, whispers spreading like wildfire. Gerald, flanked by his legal team, tried to maintain his composure as cameras flashed outside the building. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, his voice tight, as reporters hurled questions at him. "We've always operated with integrity." But his confidence wavered when an agent handed him a sealed envelope. Inside were detailed allegations, each backed by irrefutable evidence. The walls of his empire were crumbling, and Gerald Turner, the man who had always been untouchable, was now exposed. By noon, the story dominated every news channel. Gerald's image, once synonymous with success and power, was now a symbol of greed and corruption. Pundits debated his downfall, and former employees came forward with damning stories of his unethical practices. One headline in particular caught Michael's attention. "Scandal deepens. CEO's affair with employee linked to family feud." The article detailed Gerald's relationship with Laura, painting her as a willing accomplice. Photos of the two together, leaked anonymously by Michael, spread across social media. At home, Laura stared at the screen in horror. "Why would they publish this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Michael feigned concern, placing a hand on her shoulder. "The media can be relentless," he said, masking his satisfaction. Laura's hands shook as she grabbed her phone and called Gerald. "What are we going to do?" she demanded, her voice breaking. "This is spiraling out of control." Gerald's tone, once commanding, now brimmed with desperation. Stay calm, Laura. We'll handle this. Just stay out of sight for now. As the days passed, Gerald's arrogance dissolved into panic. His legal team scrambled to mitigate the damage, but the evidence was overwhelming. Investors pulled out, lawsuits piled up, and Turner Enterprises' stock plummeted. Reporters camped outside his mansion, capturing every grim-faced appearance. Inside, Gerald paced, his once immaculate suit now rumpled. "This is a witch hunt," he snapped at his lawyer. "They have nothing." His lawyer sighed. "Gerald, they have everything. The offshore accounts, the embezzlement, the bribes. It's over." Gerald slammed his fist onto the table. "No, I've worked too hard for this." But his protests were futile. The world he had built on lies was collapsing, and there was no escape. As Gerald's downfall accelerated, Laura began to distance herself. Calls went unanswered, texts ignored. When he finally reached her, her voice was cold. "I can't be tied to this, Gerald," she said. "My children, my life, I have to protect them. Don't you dare abandon me now," Gerald hissed, his desperation palpable. "You were part of this too." Laura's silence was deafening. When she hung up, Michael couldn't help but notice the tear-streaked face she tried to hide. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone measured. Laura nodded stiffly. "Just work drama. Must be hard," Michael said, echoing the same mock sympathy he had perfected. The final blow came during a live press conference. Gerald, visibly haggard, attempted to address the accusations. "I've dedicated my life to this company," he began, his voice strained. "These allegations are baseless." Before he could finish, a whistleblower stepped forward, backed by irrefutable evidence. The room erupted in chaos as reporters demanded answers. Gerald stumbled over his words, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow of itself. Watching from home, Michael felt a surge of satisfaction. "He's finished," Jake said over the phone, his voice tinged with admiration. "You really pulled it off." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen. He deserved every bit of it. The summer evening was warm, the golden light casting long shadows across the backyard. Michael adjusted the collar of his shirt, his pulse steady but his resolve unshakable. Tonight was the night. He had planned every detail, ensured every piece of evidence was in place. The backyard was filled with laughter and clinking glasses as friends and family gathered to celebrate Emma's 9th birthday. Balloons bobbed gently in the breeze, and a buffet table groaned under the weight of carefully prepared dishes. Michael glanced around, his gaze falling on Laura. She was radiant as always, her laughter ringing out like bells as she entertained the guests. For a moment, the image of her smiling face clashed painfully with the cold truth of her betrayal. As the evening progressed, Michael called for everyone's attention. "Can I have a moment, please?" he asked, his voice carrying over the chatter. The guests turned toward him, their conversations quieting. "Thank you all for being here tonight. It means so much to Emma, to Lucas, and to me." Michael began, his tone warm. "But before we cut the cake, there's something I need to share with all of you." Laura's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Michael, this is a party," she interjected, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Let's keep it light." Michael met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "This won't take long." From his pocket, he pulled out his phone and connected it to the portable speaker. "I want to play something for you," he said, his voice steady. The backyard was silent as the recording began. "It's done," Gerald's voice said, smooth and chilling. "We'll get rid of him soon. After that, we can move forward." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the recording played on, the damning words cutting through the festive atmosphere like a blade. Michael's eyes stayed fixed on Laura, whose face had gone ashen. "Michael, stop this," she said, her voice shaking. But Michael continued. He pulled a stack of printed photos from a folder and handed them to the nearest guest. "Pass these around," he said. The photos showed Laura and Gerald at dinners, shopping, and entering a hotel together. The guests murmured as the evidence made its way through the crowd, each image more incriminating than the last. Laura's composure crumbled. "This isn't what it looks like," she cried, her voice rising in desperation. "Then tell us," Michael said, his voice cold but controlled. "Tell us what it is, Laura. Explain the late nights, the secret messages, and the plans to move forward without me." Tears streaked Laura's face as she looked around, searching for an ally. But the crowd's expressions were a mixture of shock, pity, and disgust. "It was a mistake," she stammered. I wasn't thinking clearly. Michael, please, let's not do this here." "This is exactly where it needs to happen," Michael replied. "In front of the people you've lied to, the family you've betrayed." As the confrontation unfolded, several guests discreetly recorded the scene on their phones. Within hours, the videos were online, spreading like wildfire. Headlines began to emerge. "Scandal at suburban party. Woman's affair with disgraced CEO exposed." Social media erupted with reactions, and Laura's name trended within hours. Comments ranged from outrage to schadenfreude, with users dissecting every detail of the betrayal. Laura's phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and messages. Friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives reached out, some offering support, others expressing disappointment. As the party wound down, Laura sat on the patio steps, her face buried in her hands. Michael stood a few feet away, his posture rigid but his gaze unwavering. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice muffled. "You didn't have to destroy our family," Michael countered. "But you did, and now you face the consequences." He turned and walked back into the house, leaving Laura to the whispers of the remaining guests and the cold realization of her choices. The house was eerily quiet the morning after the party. Michael sat at the kitchen table, his coffee untouched, staring blankly at the faint trails of steam rising from the mug. The satisfaction of the previous night's exposure had faded, replaced by an unexpected heaviness. Upstairs, the sound of muffled sobs carried through the floorboards. Emma crying in her room. Emma's innocent world had been shattered. The night before, she had run into her room after hearing the guests whispering about her mother. This morning, she refused to come out, even as Michael knocked softly on her door. "Sweetheart," he called gently, "can we talk?" Her tiny voice, choked with tears, came through the door. "Why did you say those things about Mommy? Why were they so mean to her?" Michael's chest tightened. He leaned his head against the door, struggling to find the right words. "Emma, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes. Big ones. But I promise, everything I did was to protect you and Lucas." "It doesn't feel like it," she replied before falling silent again. Lucas, meanwhile, sat at the kitchen counter, scowling. He stabbed at his cereal with his spoon, the milk splashing onto the table. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice low but filled with anger. Michael turned to his son, surprised by the accusation. "Lucas, you know what your mother did. I couldn't let her—" Lucas interrupted, his voice rising. "She's still our mom. Now everyone at school is going to know. Do you even care what this does to us?" Michael's stomach twisted. He had expected fallout but hadn't anticipated how deeply it would affect his children. Later that day, Michael's sister, Rachel, came over. She was a fiercely protective woman who had always been on Michael's side. But today her tone was sharp as she confronted him. "Mike, what were you thinking?" she demanded, pacing the living room. "Exposing Laura like that in front of everyone, including the kids? Do you realize what you've done to them?" Michael sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I did what I had to, Rachel. She betrayed me. She betrayed all of us. I couldn't let her get away with it." Rachel stopped pacing and crossed her arms. "I'm not saying she didn't deserve consequences. But Emma's crying her eyes out, and Lucas is furious with you. You should have found another way, a private way. This was cruel." Her words hit Michael like a slap. He wanted to defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. Laura had left, taking only a suitcase and leaving behind a family in tatters. Michael sat alone in the living room, the faint glow of the television casting shadows on the walls. He turned it off, unable to focus on anything but his thoughts. He pulled out a photo album from the bookshelf, flipping through pages of memories. Emma's first steps, Lucas's soccer games, family vacations where they had all smiled for the camera, blissfully unaware of the cracks forming beneath the surface. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. In exposing Laura, he had sought justice. But at what cost? His children were collateral damage, their trust in both parents shaken. Michael leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He replayed the events of the past weeks in his mind, questioning every decision, every step of his revenge. The satisfaction of watching Gerald Turner's empire crumble felt hollow now, overshadowed by the pain he had inflicted on his own family. As dawn began to break, Michael whispered into the quiet, "Was it worth it?" The morning light filtered through the blinds, illuminating the once chaotic living room now silent and still. Michael stood by the window, coffee in hand, gazing out at the quiet street. The air felt heavier now, as if the weight of his actions lingered in the house long after Laura had left. A week after the confrontation, the doorbell rang. Michael hesitated before opening it, already knowing who it would be. Laura stood on the porch, her face pale and drawn. Her polished veneer was gone, replaced by a vulnerability Michael hadn't seen in years. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, "I need to talk to you." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe. "There's nothing left to say, Laura. Please," she pleaded, stepping closer. "I made a mistake, a horrible, unforgivable mistake, but I want to fix this. For the kids, for us." Michael's expression remained stone cold. "You didn't just betray me, Laura. You betrayed Emma, Lucas, and everything we built together. There's no coming back from that." Tears streamed down her face as she clasped her hands together. "I'll do anything, Michael. Just don't take the kids away from me." His voice was quiet but firm. "You already made that choice when you plotted against me. I'm not the one who pushed you away, Laura. That was all you." She faltered, realizing the finality in his words. Without another word, Michael stepped back and closed the door, leaving her on the porch with her regrets. In the weeks that followed, Michael focused his energy on his children. Emma still struggled with understanding the upheaval, but Lucas had started opening up after several late-night conversations. During the custody hearing, Michael presented evidence of Laura's betrayal and her complicity in Gerald's schemes. His lawyer spoke passionately about Michael's sacrifices for the family and his commitment to his children's well-being. Laura's once pristine reputation was now tarnished, and her desperation during the proceedings only solidified Michael's case. When the judge granted Michael full custody, he felt a mixture of relief and sadness. The fight was over, but the scars it left on his family would take years to heal. With custody secured, Michael set out to create a stable, nurturing environment for Emma and Lucas. He rearranged his work schedule to be home more often, attended every soccer game, and spent countless evenings helping with homework. But the emptiness left by Laura's betrayal lingered, gnawing at the edges of his newfound peace. He decided to channel that pain into something meaningful. Michael began volunteering at a local support group for individuals recovering from infidelity and betrayal. At first, he simply listened to others share their stories, but over time he began to share his own. One evening, as he recounted his journey to the group, a woman approached him afterward. "Hearing you talk about finding strength in the middle of all that chaos, it's inspiring," she said. Michael nodded, her words resonating deeply. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of purpose beyond his pain. One crisp autumn evening, Michael stood in the backyard watching Emma and Lucas play with the family dog. Laughter echoed through the air, and for a moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift. "Dad, come play," Lucas called, holding up a soccer ball. Michael smiled, setting his coffee down. "All right, but don't expect me to go easy on you." As he joined his children, the joy in their eyes reminded him of why he had fought so hard to protect them. Later that night, as he tucked Emma into bed, she looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. "I'm glad you're here, Daddy." Michael kissed her forehead, his heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. "I'll always be here, sweetheart. Always." Sitting alone in his study, Michael opened the journal he had started during the ordeal. Flipping through its pages, he saw the evolution of his emotions. Anger, grief, resolve, and, finally, hope. He wrote a single sentence on the last page. Justice is not just about consequences. It's about creating a foundation for something better. As he closed the journal, Michael felt a quiet strength within him. His life had been irrevocably changed, but he was ready to rebuild. Not just for himself, but for his children and the future they deserved. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. He was free to move forward, stronger and wiser than before. The waves crashed gently against the shore as Michael watched Emma and Lucas build a sandcastle near the water's edge. The warm sun glinted off the ocean, the sound of seagulls filling the air. It was their first vacation in years, and Michael had chosen a small, quiet beach town, far from the chaos of their old life. Lucas called out, his voice tinged with excitement. "Dad, look, we made a moat." Michael grinned, shading his eyes as he walked toward them. "Looks like a castle fit for a king and queen," he said, crouching down beside them. Emma giggled, her laughter a melody Michael hadn't heard in too long. "And you can be the knight who protects us, Daddy." His heart swelled with pride and relief. For the first time in months, the weight of the past seemed to ease, replaced by the simple joy of being present with his children. Later that evening, as the children slept, Michael sat on the porch of their rented beach house, a glass of wine in hand. The ocean stretched out before him, endless and serene. The solitude was broken by the soft sound of footsteps on the gravel path. "Beautiful night," a voice said. Michael turned to see a woman standing a few feet away, her arms wrapped around herself against the cool breeze. She looked familiar. Someone he'd noticed earlier that day at the local cafe where he'd taken Emma and Lucas for ice cream. "It is," Michael replied, gesturing to the chair beside him. "Care to join me?" She hesitated, then smiled and sat down. "I'm Sophie," she said, extending her hand. "Michael," he replied, shaking it. For the next hour, they talked about everything and nothing. How she had moved to the town a year ago to start fresh after her own divorce. How Michael was here with his kids to do the same. There was an ease to their conversation, a shared understanding of loss and renewal. As Sophie stood to leave, she hesitated. "Maybe we could get coffee tomorrow?" Michael nodded, a cautious but genuine smile on his face. "I'd like that." The vacation ended all too soon, but Michael returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. He had found a rhythm in his new life, one that revolved around his children, his work, and the possibility of opening his heart again. One evening, as he tucked Emma into bed, she asked, "Do you think Mom will ever come back?" Michael paused, choosing his words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart, but no matter what, you and Lucas will always have me." She nodded, satisfied with his answer, and drifted off to sleep. In his study, Michael opened his journal once more. The words he had written weeks ago stared back at him. Justice is not just about consequences. It's about creating a foundation for something better. He added a final line beneath it. "They thought they destroyed me, but I'm stronger now than ever." Michael closed the journal, placing it on the shelf. His journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next, with resilience, hope, and an unshakable belief in his ability to rebuild. As he turned out the light and walked down the hall, the laughter of Emma and Lucas echoed in his mind, a reminder of all he had fought for and all he had gained.